She seems authoritative.
She seems like authority.
She grants authority. You just put on a little like leader hats. The one around in jeans. This blue t-shirt.
And an enormous flashlight that is probably more.
What's the site?
If you had a dog.
Live stream this?
You can get it from YouTube, and you can also Google Hangouts. Yeah, I guess it just automatically goes to YouTube as well.
Are they listening to our conversation?
As of like 25
Run,
seconds.
women, run!
As of like 25 seconds ago, yeah.
Oh.
So they missed all this stuff before that about Ninja Turtles and everything.
That was the best part.
No.
Yeah.
The charging. Yeah.
I'll just start.
I don't want to like.
I had a question last time. Oh, shredder. No. That's why I look very.
Okay, well let's get started. My goal is to try to keep this as brisk as possible and get done way before 9, if at all possible, but to still not miss anything and be informative. And not only informative about applying to grad school, which is kind of the official topic. That should be relatively quick, but there's going to be some bonus footage too, because there's a few other topics that I'll touch on that I think might be helpful. But even so, the goal is to get done well before 9 o'clock, so you won't be here too long. So probably the most informative place to start with applying to grad school is the admissions process, because if you understand how admissions works, right, what the grads programs are doing, that'll help you sort of understand what you should do to make your application as attractive as possible. And I've been on, I don't know how many admissions committees. There are a huge amount of work. I've been on admissions committees here and then also at Pitt, which is my first faculty job. That was in the late 90s. So I've got experience with at least 2 institutions. And they're pretty similar. There's a few little differences, but the differences don't really matter. And I think most admissions committees work more or less in the same way. There's not a whole lot of variance in terms of what you can do. So the way the process works typically, well, I'll just describe here our process. Before applications start coming in, the due date is for us is mid-January or so, a committee is formed, the admissions committee, which for us is 3 people, and then I, the DGS, Director of Graduate Studies, is sort of ex officio as a 4th member on that. And when we try to sort of get diverse people on that committee in terms of areas of interest, so we try not to have 3 historians or 3 metaphysicians or whatever. We try to get someone broadly from value theory, ethics, whatever, someone from history, someone from M&E, philosophy of science type fields. So there's representation on the committee for most areas. Then the fun starts. There's 150, 200 applications that come in. It's typically a 2 or 3 step process, depending on how you count steps. Step 1 is to get the whole pile of applications of 200 or whatever down into a much smaller pile, a short list or medium list that will receive more attention. Our short lists are usually in the neighborhood of 40 or 50 files, something like that. That's usually a quicker process because there's just literally not time to go through 200 applications in detail. They all have a writing sample, they all have letters, they all have transcripts that are really complicated. Nevertheless, it's possible to sort out to some extent people who are probably right for the program and people who are probably not right for the program. Not to say that mistakes aren't made at that stage, but there it is. The second stage is then going from that medium list that gets much more attention. People try to be very diligent in reading the entire file. going from that list down to some kind of smaller list. Now, what that is will depend on the department and depend on how they do admissions. If you do admissions by having a list of people you admit and a wait list, then that's what you try to get down to, right? Like you're going to admit 8 people and you have a wait list of 8 people or something like that. Then you get down to 16. And you would try to either rank them or at least put them in the 2 groups so you know who you want to admit, who you want to put on a wait list. We do it a little bit differently, and I think the way we do it is unusual. What we do is we sort of know what our average acceptance rate is. Typically, it's around 25% of the grad students we accept that we accept our offers. Okay. If we are then shooting for an incoming class, say of 7, then we will just admit around 28. The upside of that is that it means we don't have to divide people into the golden sort of benighted group of those who are admitted and then the second-rate people who are on a wait list. I mean, one of the things we like about our department here is we try to keep things kind of egalitarian, and that's one of the advantages of that. One of the disadvantages is there's fluctuation. So for instance, 2 years ago we had a huge incoming class. It was just a statistical fluke, and we had 14 people, which was way bigger than ideally we would have had. But it's okay. It works out. The next year we shoot for a smaller class, and so it averages out. But whichever way you go, that's then the second cut in the admission cycle, is to get from the medium list down to an admit list or an admit list plus wait list or something like that. So how do those 2 things happen? What are the mechanics of that? Well, as you know, there's basically 5 parts to a file, okay, or an application. There's the writing sample, GRE scores, transcripts, letters of recommendation, and everyone's favorite, the personal statement or statement of purpose. What we do is everyone on the admissions committee sort of assigns to each application a score, just depends on the year, but it could be 1 through 10 or 1 through 100 or whatever. It depends, changes year to year. And then we just use that score as at least a starting point. Assign a score to every file, we get together, and then we sort of sit down as a committee and say, okay, here are all the scores. If we just took the top 50 people for the medium list, this is the group we would have. And then we look at that and see, oh, okay, well, actually this person here who was number 54, I think kind of got a raw deal. This one's pretty good. So some negotiation at that point for individual people. If someone really thinks that they were good, or someone kind of managed to get a fan on the admissions committee because of something in their file, then there will be some lobbying at that point. And it's a similar process for going from the medium list to the regular list. There's scores. The difference is that the files get read more thoroughly, and there's more negotiation at that point because everyone's very familiar with all the files. So there's more. It's less reliant on the pure numerical scores, I guess, that people provide. Now, one question everybody asks, and now I'm in a position to give you the answer. Here's the magic question. What's the most important part of the application? I get this like all the time. People send emails and they want to apply to the program, but they want to know. Are GREs more important than writing sample? Here's the bad news. You're not going to like this at all. It depends on who's on the admissions committee, and everyone's different. Some people think that letters carry 0 information, and you may as well just ignore them. I'm kind of one of those people myself. Why? Because letter writers are tremendously variable. Some letter writers will just, whether they know you or not, whether they like you or not, they're going to go and just over the top on the letter about how you are the best student they've ever seen in 20 years. Some people are much more kind of brutally honest. And so it's kind of a crapshoot, who's writing the letter. And so because of that, I tend to think that they really don't carry a whole lot of information. Other people disagree completely. There are people who think the letters are one of the best sources of information because you're getting firsthand report from someone who knows this person and has seen them work, and I'm sure there's something to that. GREs, some people think that they're completely useless. Don't like standardized tests, think that there's all kinds of problems with standardized tests, ignore them. Other people think that they're one of the best sources of information. John Hoagland, who was faculty at Pitt when I was there, he was director of graduate studies for a while. He claimed to have done research that showed that of all the things in an application file, the only thing that was a predictor of success in graduate school was the analytic GRE score. Now, I don't know how he did that. I kind of guess how you would have to do that, and it's pretty arduous, so if he did it, I salute him. The bad news is they don't have that test anymore. They got rid of the analytic GRE test and replaced it with the analytic writing component. So even if he was right, it doesn't matter, sadly, because that would have been really easy. You just get the analytic GRE scores in and rank them and admit the top 10 people, and then you go home. Sadly, that's not the case. Transcripts, same thing. Tremendous variation, right? Some students take hard classes, or they had to work full-time while they were going to school. Their GPA is going to suffer compared to someone who didn't have to work, whose family could support them completely, or who didn't take difficult classes outside the major and sort of be more sort of adventurous in their education. So again, very noisy source of information. Writing sample. Now, there are a lot of people who think the writing sample is the only thing that you can tell anything about, because this is actually the student's work and you can see their work. Again, there's two sides to that. I'm a little more skeptical of the writing sample as a source of information for reasons similar to the transcripts, but that go beyond that to some extent. Some programs, some departments have honors writing or honors thesis programs where if you're a major, you have a whole course devoted to you working on this one paper, and you get lots of dedicated feedback from a faculty member, or at least one faculty member that helps you write this. Some departments don't have that, and if you're a student in that department, you just don't have that advantage. Some smaller departments, the students in those departments don't get the same kind of feedback and the same kind of mentoring in terms of how to write a paper that someone in a bigger department is going to get. That's why I also don't think the writing sample is necessarily a hugely great source of information. There could be some great applicants who, for whatever reason, their writing sample just isn't that good because they haven't had the mentoring or whatever. You might ask me at this point, well, what do you look at, Rick? Because I'm pretty much skeptical of everything. So, which is why I hate being on admissions committees. Actually, I do. I hate it more than search committees. So search committees where you're actually looking to hire people. That's also a lot of work. But there, it's a little bit easier because I don't think there's as much variation. I think when you read somebody's dissertation, that's a better reflection of what they can really do. That's a little bit more insulated from the exigencies of weird life circumstances. So I don't feel quite as bad. But with undergraduates applying, there's just so much stuff that I, as an evaluator, have no idea what's going on behind this application, which makes it really difficult. Nevertheless, be informed that different people on this committee are going to have their own different ideas about which elements of it are important and which elements of it are completely useless. And so the answer to the question, what's the most important part of the file, is nobody knows. It depends on who's on that committee and what their quirky beliefs are. So the advice is try to make every one of those components as good as you can. That's how you're, statistically speaking, going to sort of increase your chances of doing well. How can you make those things as good as you can? Well, let's go through the 5 things, and I'll say a little bit about each of the 5. So I'll leave the writing sample for last because then that'll kind of segue into one of the things I want to talk about that isn't directly related to admissions. GREs, how do you get those better? Practice, take GRE preparation courses, you know, the usual things. I mean, there's no mystery about how to get better at the GREs. There's a whole industry sort of surrounding that. What I did, now keep in mind, this was like Iron Age stuff going on when I took the GREs myself, but I didn't take a prep course specifically for the GREs, but what I did is I just went and bought a book. You guys may have seen those in old movies. They're like these, well, actually there's some right here. I got a book that was just a set of 15 or so actual GRE tests, like old exams. And I just worked through them all. Just took practice exam after practice exam, timed myself for 30 minutes on each one. So I had a sense for which sections, you know, I would have plenty of time on, which I might not have time on. So not only was I getting practice with the problems, I was also getting practice with the strategy of time management, which is part of the GRE test. So that's what I did. But, you know, obviously there's lots of things you can do for the GREs. For the letters of recommendation, couple things that I can say about that. There's typically a minimum number of letters that a place wants. My personal belief, and I don't know if a lot of people would disagree with this, some might, is that you're better off sticking to the minimum. That 3 good letters is better than 4 good letters and a mediocre letter, where one of them's mediocre, rather. So just try to figure out who you think is going to write you the best letter, and I'll talk about what makes a good letter in a minute. And just get that set, whether it's 2 or 3 or whatever. Because, yeah, whatever that small number is, if they're really, really good, that's what's going to help you. How can you help make these letters better? Because in some sense, they're kind of out of your hands. They're not entirely out of your hands, though. One, you can sort of select who writes the letter. So ideally, it would be someone who knows you pretty well, because a good letter is a letter that talks about their experience with you, right, in class. You know, this person, you know, consistently, you know, it didn't talk a whole lot, but when, you know, when she did talk, she always brought up great points, and maybe they'll even have an anecdote about, you know, a class session where you did something really, you know, said something really awesome. And they came to my office hours and discussed this, that, and the other thing, and I think that their, you know, paper on XYZ was really, really good. So someone who knows you well, that's going to be a plus, especially if they think you're good. Now, someone who knows you well, but you know, you have reason to think that maybe they think you suck, that's okay. But all else being equal, someone who knows you well will be in a position to write a letter that could be better because they could put more detail in that letter. Sometimes I get asked to write letters for undergraduates for various things who are in this logic class I teach, which is this huge lecture course. And it's like 300 students, and I don't, you know, there's maybe 2 or 3 of them that I get to know, or 5 tops. The TAs get to know a lot of them better because they're in, you know, they break up to smaller discussion sections. And I'm at a loss. You know, the best I can do is say, you know, this person was in my class, here's the grade they got. These scores are actually pretty good. They're in the top 5% or, you know, top 2% of the scores in the class or whatever. But I can't really say anything, you know, personally about the student. And maybe that's all they need, depending on what they're going for. But someone who knows you better is going to do a better job of writing a letter that can help you. What else? Help the letter writer out. So when you ask them to write a letter, you know, be prepared to give them information. Maybe there's things that you've done that they're unaware of. You know, you're the president of the philosophy club, and they might not know that. Or something else that might be relevant. Some people who've asked me to write letters send me a CV or, you know, a resume or something that has all of their information on it. So if there's anything like that you have, or that you can give the letter writer that will help them do it, maybe even talk to them about the letter instead of just sending an email. Hey, can you write me a letter? send, and then you go off and whatever. Talk to them. Go in person, meet the letter writer, say, hey, I'd like you to write the letter. Is there anything I can do to help you write a good letter? And start a conversation about that. That's about all I can think of in terms of the letter. But the point is that you do have a little bit of influence on that letter. It's not entirely out of your hands. Transcripts. Yeah, that one, I mean, in some sense, it's entirely in your hands, but it's a long-term thing. The details, are now in the hands of your past selves, and your current self can't really do a whole lot about it. What you can do, and this is something that can come out in a personal statement, is if, for example, maybe your GPA isn't the most awesome GPA, but there's reasons for that. Right, you double majored in philosophy and mechanical engineering, where the average grade is like a C+ or something like that, or you had to work full time. Those kinds of pieces of information are things that can show up in a personal statement. Okay, and sometimes they can be very helpful because admissions committees want to know that. I mean, you want to get people who are good, and so if someone might slip under the radar because their GPA is a little bit low, but they could have said something that alerted you to the fact that there's a good explanation for why it's low. That low GPA doesn't reflect the fact that they do mediocre work. It's there because of something else. Bring that up and tell them in that letter. So what are some of the things that could be good explanations for either a single bad grade or an overall GPA that's not super stellar? You have to work, or other kinds of hardships that sort of prevent you from being able to put your full energy into studies. So if there's anything like that, mention it. If you take classes, that aren't just easy A's, okay. Some people double major in philosophy and something that's really difficult, and they're going to have a lower GPA probably than someone who is just philosophy. And I know a lot of people here do English literature and stuff like that, so that don't take this the wrong way. English classes have the highest GPA of anybody. They just give out A's like they're M&Ms in English classes. And I know that because I've actually looked at statistics of stuff like that, which is great. Every department has its own norms. Physics gives everyone a C. Right? It's impossible to get an A. Right? The average score on every exam is like 40% or something. So, whatever. Every discipline has its own norms. But that doesn't always come through in the transcript. So, inform people of that. Sometimes if there's a specific class that, you got a really bad grade in, there might be an explanation for that. For example, when I was an undergraduate, there was one class that I forget what I got. It was a really bad grade, but there was an explanation. There was like something that happened that quarter that was pretty disruptive in terms of my overall life situation. And so I talked about that a little bit, and I ended up getting into grad school, so I don't know if they had pity on my soul or what, but I at least said something about it. So even though you can't change your transcript at this point when you apply, you can at least explain the transcript to some extent, especially if there are things there that prima facie might look less than awesome. You can sort of explain why they don't look awesome, even though you still are awesome. Okay. The personal statement or statement of purpose, that's tough. That's maybe the second most common question I get. What are we supposed to put in a personal statement? Some people, I ignore them myself, and the reason I ignore them is because I know nobody knows what they're supposed to do in them. So because of that, it carries no information about how good of a grad student someone's going to be. That's at least my take on it. Except for where they give something about like an explanation for why they got a bad grade or something. Obviously, that's useful information. But I think I'm an outlier. I think a lot of people do read those personal statements and try to take information from them. What kind of information is relevant? Well, one thing that's particularly relevant that could go in there is if there's a particular graduate program or your application to a specific graduate program, there's a specific reason you want to go there. So for instance, if your interests are really lined up with, you know, the department's strengths or a particular person in that department, and you can make a convincing case as to the fact that that's true, because a lot of people just say that. In fact, and it's pretty easy to tell. I've had people like misspell the names of people on our faculty. I've been a big fan of Professor X. They mangle the spelling of their name. You know they have no idea who this person is. They just kind of. So, you know, if you're going to do that, I mean, do it, you know, in good faith, but explain, you know, I have these interests and they really line up with this faculty member, these 2 or 3 faculty members. I think that their work is the kind of thing that I want to pursue. So you can make a case for why you're a good fit with that department. That's something you can say in the statement that would be useful. Or is there anything else that could be useful besides the stuff I talked about earlier, right? You know, explanations for you know, GRE scores or GPA or something like that. I have a hard time thinking of anything myself. Yeah.
Do you care like about like people's like backstories at all?
Care about people's backstories? In general, no, unless the backstory is something like, you know, I had to work, you know, 2 jobs full time my whole life to support my younger brothers and sisters. That's relevant because now you know that this person, you know, got a decently high GPA while they were, you know, working their butt off or something like that. So for me, that kind of thing can be relevant. But a story about, you know, how you first fell in love with philosophy is, you know, I first read this book when I was 15 years old that, you know, about Socrates' life, and it changed that, you know, yeah, am I a cynical bastard? Sure. So, okay, fine. But, you know, everyone's got, you know, that doesn't tell me anything about how good of a graduate student you might end up being, that kind of thing. Again, I might be an outlier. I'm one person, so I'm only speaking for myself. But for me, those kinds of things don't really aren't that important in going through the files. They can be interesting, but in terms of, you know, how that's going to translate into someone making the medium list or short list, yeah, no. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition from the whole list to the medium list, like what you throw people out? Is it like a minimum GPA, or is it something you use to just kind of toss the duds?
Toss the duds. So the question is, what are the criteria that are used to go down to the medium list? Again, it just goes to whoever's on that admissions committee. So some committee members might think, oh, anything less than a 3.4 GPA, screw it, they're out, or anything less than a certain score on GRE. Some might think that way. I think even at that first stage, though, people take a more holistic look. They don't look at they don't have time to look carefully through the entire application, but they do have some time, and you know, they'll look at those test scores, they'll look at the numerical things. They might either look at the letters carefully or at least skim them. Ditto for the writing sample, at least skim through it or get a sense, read the first page, last page, or something at a minimum. So they do have some information to go on that can sort of be holistically evaluated. But at that point, it's up to the quirks of the person who's on the committee in terms of what they focus on or what they think is important. Yeah.
I was wondering, what if your backstory is directly linked to why you want to be in a certain department?
Then that could be. If the backstory is linked to why that you want to be at that department or why this department is a great fit for you, then yeah, that could be relevant, certainly. Yeah.
Is there sort of a disregard for like similarities or things that tend to be more generic and more present in students when they're like in their application, say students talking about similar things or having, I don't know, even similar interests and activities, things like that? Do that kind of play a part in like disregarding like the medium to short list?
Similar in what? Similar to what?
I don't know. I guess I'm saying more so like, what if your personal statement is kind of more so generic, and you're not making out, I guess, special arguments. Where I've heard a lot that like it matters standing out when you're going through like applications. So the best way to stand out apart from like groups, and so that things aren't like repetitive.
For people who look at the letters, that might be true. Personally, like I said, I wouldn't care about stuff like that and part of the reason is because I know people go into writing that letter not knowing what to do. So someone might have a really, really interesting, thing to say. They just didn't realize that that's the kind of thing you're supposed to do in that letter. Some people might have something that's quasi-interesting, but they're just a pretty good writer, and they can embellish it into something that just seems awesome and compelling. Standing out, again, there might be people who disagree with this. I'm not sure there would be a whole lot. Standing out would be standing out in terms of something that's academically marked somehow. Like you're standing out because, your GPA is off the charts, or your test scores were, you got 800s on everything in the GRE all 3 times you took it, or, something like that. Or, standing out, it could be because of, some like hardship factors. We've had I've seen some applicants where the application itself was okay, not great, not sucky, but then, you read that personal statement and the stuff this person did and went through, and you go, holy cow, person has gone through that and did all this stuff, and, on top of it, did these things with the philosophy club and did all of this great stuff. That can make an impact. That, I can remember even now, some of those files stood out for those kinds of reasons. But, something like, I was on Jimmy Kimmel Live playing concert piano. Yeah, it stands out, but, that doesn't mean that you're going to be a good grad student in philosophy. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
What about for your letters? Like if you had a letter from a different department, would that make
good
you
question.
stand out and be interesting, or would that be something like where you would want to see all the letters from philosophy?
That's a really good question. So the question is, I'm just repeating for people who are viewing at home.
Even if it's the English professor.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Oh, that's where that email came from. Okay. The question is, does it help to have letters from outside the department? Either letters maybe from a philosopher, but from another institution, or it could also be outside philosophy. There are 2 different ways of being outside. They can. It depends. So, again, if the person can say things, they're in a position to say things about you. And for all of you, that might very well be the case when you apply, because, Janan Ismail and Gina Schouten are going to know your work pretty well, and they're probably at different institutions from the institutions you're at. So they might be good choices, potentially. Don't tell them I said that. Yeah, I write enough letters as it is, and you just put 18 more on my to-do list. So I didn't say that. But that could be, if they can say something, they worked with you, they know your work, they can say substantive things, then yeah, that can be good. Just the fact that they're from another institution by itself, not so much. Especially if they're from another institution, but they don't know you that well, and they write, one paragraph that's kind of generic. Yeah, this person sat into my class, they seemed really smart, they wrote a great paper. The fact that they're from another institution doesn't help too much. From different departments, non-philosophy departments, that can be helpful if it's relevant. So, for instance, if you're a student, you're doing philosophy of physics or philosophy of biology or some sort of political thing, and you've done some political science courses, for example, that can be useful because then it speaks to your ability to do this other side of this interdisciplinary thing that you might be doing as a grad student. But again, you'd want it to be from someone who knows you pretty well, has experience with you, and is going to write a pretty solid letter for you. A good letter from someone else in the philosophy department is going to have a better impact on your application than a mediocre letter from somebody outside the department. Definitely. I think you were next.
I had two questions about the letter of recommendation. The first one is if we could use the same letter, like if we get it prepared like this year, but then we take a year off and then we want to use that letter, like seeing that maybe it was dated a year ago, would that be a bad thing?
Not necessarily. So usually when, this happens to most people. They write letters and then they get asked a year later, 2 years later to write a letter. Typically what people will do is they will, or what I do, and I think most people do this, go back to the letter that they wrote 2 years ago and update it. So one thing you can do in this case is just tell the person, oh, and by the way, in the last 2 years, here's what I've done. So that they have something else they can say to update it. And then stick a new date on the letter. If for some reason they don't do that, that's not, they just send the same letter out again for whatever reason. It's got a 2-year-old date. I don't think that's that bad.
And then also, what were we just talking about before that?
Other department.
Oh yeah, and if you're like interning at like, I don't know, like a college or something, do you think we could, is it a good idea to get a letter of recommendation from like an academic institution you work for, that's not necessarily a professor?
Again, I think only if somehow it kind of relates directly or indirectly to your academic capacity. Either directly because this person has some academic contact with you in terms of what great work you do, or indirectly because this person can speak to the fact that you volunteer 40 hours a week helping starving children, and that's then that's going to be indirectly relevant to your academic stuff because it'll partially it could explain why your GPA is only 3.8 not 4.0 or something like that. But if it doesn't speak to directly or indirectly to academic things, then it might not be that helpful. Yeah.
So I spoke with a department head at another institution who seemed to imply that the reputation of the letter writers would weigh heavily. Do you find that that's a common within other departments?
The short answer is yeah. That probably I would probably agree with that. So the question is, does the prestige of the letter writer, name recognition, value of the letter writer matter? The short answer is yes, statistically so. It's always going to depend on who's on the search committee. Some people on the search committee might not care. Oh yeah, it's a big name person, so what? Might be someone that just dislikes that person, right? It's a big name person. That means you've got fans. It also means you've got anti-fans. But I think statistically speaking, it is going to be a plus if it's a name recognition person. All else being equal, yeah.
And going off of that, what about the prestige of the institution that we're coming from?
In terms of letters or in terms of just general?
Generally.
Yeah, so does the prestige of the institution you're coming from matter? Not as much as you might think. It probably does, but again, not as much as you might think. There's certainly going to be some indirect benefits sometimes, depending on the institution. So, for instance, people who come from a big department with great philosophers and a rich program that has, honors thesis courses and stuff like that, they're going to get a level of mentoring and opportunity to produce good-looking stuff that someone in a small college isn't going to have. Now, savvy people on admissions committees are going to be kind of aware of that and are going to, look at someone from a small college who, their application isn't as shiny and sparkly, but tell that, okay, even so, this person is really good. But not everyone, is that savvy, and so there will be indirect benefits like that from the department you're in. But the mere fact that, oh, this person was an undergraduate at Princeton and this other person was an undergraduate at, Cal State, San Marcos. Not a huge impact, but it could with some people. Yeah.
Should students coming from small or unknown departments be concerned about multiple students from that same small department applying to the same graduate program?
No, there's one possible thing though that I'll mention that can be weird, but generally speaking, that's not a problem if multiple people from the same department apply. The one place it can get weird is when you get two people from the same department apply, and I get the file from person A, and I pick it up and it says, person A is the best student I've had in 5 years, right? Well, automatically, and then they will also, same person writes a letter for person B, and they say, person B is really, really great. Well, or worse, for the letter writer, they say, person B is the best student I've had in 5 years. So there can be weird things in the letters, but that doesn't always happen. I mean, sometimes they're different letter writers in the same institution, or sometimes they, put things in a way that it's not going to sort of unjustly sort of create a sort of comparison between the two people. But that would be, I think, the one place where that can play out is in the letters, possibly. But aside from that, it doesn't matter. I mean, we've admitted multiple people from the same place various times. It just depends on if we think they're good or not, and that's it. Yeah.
What would you say about contacting people you're particularly interested in studying with, and beforehand, during the application process, or like as you're getting ready to apply, being like, I'm reaching out to you, I love this, I'm very interested in studying this with you, and what the content of that email or letter should be.
Yeah, so the value of contacting someone in the department whose work that you think resonates with yours or that you might pursue.
And in a genuine way, obviously, right. Not doing it to everyone in the department.
Yeah. It can be a big plus. So for instance, if, and this has happened here, someone who, there have been students who have they're really good in some field, philosophy of X, philosophy of biology, let's say. I'll make up a fictional case. They might, get in touch with, Bill Bechtel, who's the person in our department who does philosophy of biology, send him a paper, get in touch, and then Bill gets really impressed. Say, oh, this is a really great paper. If he has time to read it. Now, the person you contact may not have much time, so it's a crapshoot to some extent. But if for whatever reason they do have time to sort of get to know you or your work enough to have a significant positive opinion of it, that can be a big plus. And that's happened a number of times in the past admissions committees here, where somebody who wasn't on the admissions committee sent us an email or talked to us in the hallway, and this so-and-so contacted me, they said they were going to apply, and I read a paper and it was really, really good. You should make sure you look at their application really seriously, something like that. So it can be a plus, definitely. But it'll depend upon two things. It'll depend upon you having something that's good enough to really genuinely catch their eye and make them think that you're somehow, you stand out from the crowd in this field or something like that. And B, them having the time to recognize that. And if those two planets align, then that can be good. Yeah.
Is there any benefit or harm just to be like a woman in an application?
Benefit or harm to being a woman? Probably both. Now I'm just speaking as, well, I'll speak both as just a general person who kind of knows some psychological results about bias, but also as someone who's got experience with admissions committees. It can be a negative in a lot of ways. As I'll know, there's a lot of implicit bias that goes on that people aren't aware of, and that's a real thing. So and I don't think philosophers are immune to that. So just like anybody applying to anything, there's a lot of empirical results that show that there is a bias there. That said, I think there are a lot of philosophers who are cognizant of that and try to either ignore it or compensate for it somehow. So for instance, we have a faculty member here. I won't name names because this is being recorded. I don't want anyone to get in trouble. But we have a faculty member here who, and I think this person is basically right, just says, look, when I'm evaluating files, if it's from a woman, I just, plus 10 points. Why? Well, because there's empirical evidence to the effect that this person's letter writers are probably going to have some implicit bias, even if they are equally good to some guy that they graduated with, the letter might not be quite as glowing. They've experienced enough other biases that have artificially brought these other measures down a little bit, that in order to compensate for that, I'm just throwing plus 10 on the whatever numerical score, which I think is probably legit thing to do. So some people try to compensate, or they're aware of it at a minimum, and maybe try to compensate for it somehow at a maximum. It can also, can it be a benefit? It can be a huge benefit. I should put this on pause so that it doesn't get recorded. I hate saying things that are on permanent record, but it is just a fact that a lot of departments want to admit more women. They realize that there's an issue with gender balance. Now there's two motivations for it. Some departments, I think, have genuine, good motivations. They want to do positive things to get the discipline steered in a better direction, and that's their motivation. I am quite sure there are some departments whose motivation is not, it's like, well, it looks pretty crappy if we're 99% guys, so we need, just for marketing purposes, we need to sort of, throw a bunch of extra money at N of the female applicants to try to convince them to come here so that our numbers don't look as crappy when people do the statistics. So I think there's both kinds of motivation, but the result is that to some extent good female applicants are kind of a coveted commodity. When I was at Pitt, for example, and it's kind of the same thing here to some extent, a lesser extent, but I remember the graduate students at one point complained. They talked to me a lot because they got to know me, and once people get to know me, they're no longer intimidated by me. They tell me all kinds of shit. But they said, God, our admissions committees suck here because they're so biased. We just have all men all the time that they get in, and they were right. If you looked at the incoming class, there was this huge disparity. There weren't very many women coming in, and if you just saw that, you would think, oh, the admissions committee or something like that is really biased. We're not admitting women. What they didn't know, because they weren't on the committee and they weren't part of the process, is that we admitted like 40% women. They all got outbid by NYU and Princeton on all of them. I mean literally outbid, like dollars, like checkbook. There you go. That's happened to us here at UCSD. We've been outbid by other departments. So it can also be a plus in that way. That's actually one of the problems we've had historically, is that here at UCSD is we've tried to be very egalitarian. So a lot of departments have a history of being inegalitarian in their admissions. Some applicants who look great, they just give them better offers. You got more fellowship time, we're going to give you more money, whatever. And then other applicants who aren't as shiny get not quite as great offers. And the result is it ends up people end up finding out. It ends up creating this kind of implicit or sometimes even explicit like class system in the grad programs and stuff like that. And historically, we've tried to avoid that. Everyone gets the same offer. Everyone has the same thing. But that started to work against us because it means we're susceptible to getting outbid. That's happened to us a lot the last. There's a woman who we admitted we really like. Department X also admitted this person, and 2 days before the deadline, Department X just throws $5,000 more at them because they want them to come there, and we can't then do anything without upsetting our egalitarian approach. So that has created problems for us historically that aren't, what do we do? Do we become an egalitarian in order to not sort of fall farther behind, whatever? So that's a whole lot of information you guys don't need. That's my issue to worry about as Director of Graduate Studies, how to try and solve that problem. But it can work in your favor in those ways. So the answer is both. It can work against you. There are things that work against you as a woman, but there are also some things that can work for you. Yeah.
About the mentioning hardships and in that sense in the personal statement, I'm sort of hesitant about, like whether, crossing the line of, I'm not sure what's appropriate and what's not, and that's one. And then two is like, I don't want it to be like sound like I'm asking for pity or like asking for compensation. I feel like it's like, even if there's something that I would want to mention, hypothetically, I don't know if I'd necessarily put that in my application, but do you think that it would be worth it, like worthwhile?
It can be, definitely. I mean, but a lot, this is a sort of case where so much depends on context and so much depends upon you that it's really a case-by-case call, right? The exact nature of the circumstances can vary tremendously. I mean, there's a million things that could be circumstances, and then some of it also has to do with just your personality. Some people are more comfortable sharing stuff that's very personal, and some people are less comfortable sharing stuff. Can it help? Yeah, definitely. Can it sometimes seem like someone's trying to get pity and game the system? It can sometimes. Depends on how it's worded, and it depends on the context. But I think it can be information that admissions committees want to have, or at least should want to have if they're doing their job better, is to be made aware of things that are circumstances like that can affect parts of the file, definitely. There's actually a couple questions from people watching at home. I'll go ahead and answer. And then you just raised your hand, so you'll be next after these two. Oh, so many. My goal was to end before 9, and you guys are not helping me out with this. Do you think the topic of the writing sample matters? And do you think participating in undergrad conferences or submitting to undergrad journals makes a difference in our application? That's from Maggie Newton. The topic can matter in a couple of ways. One, if it's a topic that someone on the admissions committee knows a lot about, they're in a better position to assess it, which can work for you or against you, right? Someone who knows a lot about that topic might be able to tell that the paper you wrote's crap, whereas someone who doesn't know about the topic might not know that. It might look good to them. They just don't know that, yeah, the points you were making were actually, debunked 5 years ago in the literature, and anyone worth their salt knows that they've been debunked, whereas, someone outside the field wouldn't necessarily know that. So it could work against you, but you don't have control over who's on the admissions committee. You can't try to predict that. It can also be good or bad in the following way. It depends on the mesh with the strengths or who's in the department. So for instance, if we get a writing sample from someone and the topic is on something, it's clear that that's kind of their interest, but it's something that our department doesn't do, we don't have anyone that does that, then it can raise questions like, well, is this person really a good fit? There's other department that has people that are good in this area, and that person would really do much better in that other department, let's say. But it can also work for you, right? If you come here and your writing sample is in philosophy of physics, I mean, we have loads of philosophy of physics here, philosophy of mind, for instance, or, you know, your papers on meta-ethics, and, you know, we've got, or whatever, Kant. We're stacked with Kant, right? And so it could potentially work in your favor if it turns out that you look like you're a serious Kant person and you've got a really good Kant paper and our Kant people read it and they're impressed, then it can be a plus. So in those ways, it can end up making a difference. As far as submitting to undergrad journals and stuff like that, it can be a plus. Again, it depends on who's on the committee. It probably, I have a hard time imagining it ever be a minus. I don't think anyone on an admissions committee would ever look at it and take points off. Some might not add points or many points, but there are some that probably would add a lot of points. So it probably is a net plus. There's probably a pretty fast half-life on those things in the following sense. You'll probably get a lot of value out of 1 or 2, but beyond 2 trips to undergrad conferences probably isn't. You know, 4 or 5 undergrad conference papers probably is going to look much better than 2 undergrad conference papers. Same thing for journal submissions. You know, you might get some bonus points for 1 or 2, but, you know, 3, 4, and 5 aren't going to help you out much more than that. So that was Maggie Newton. Jessica Roberts asks, would it hurt my chances of getting into graduate school for philosophy if I take time off between undergrad and grad school? Is there a window of time for getting into grad school after undergrad? Depends on how much time. If it's you know, small single digits, 1, 2, 3 years, probably not going to be a factor. If it starts stretching out a long time, then, you know, it could be an issue in a variety of ways, right? You just might not be able to get letters. People might forget. So it could have those kinds of impacts. And some people on some admissions committees might think, you know, that, or might suspect or worry that, you know, you've been out doing whatever for 4 years. Maybe your philosophy chops aren't quite as crisp as they used to be. You know, the writing sample is 4 years old or 10 years old or whatever. So it could be a negative, but I would guess that 1, 2, 3 years, probably not. Once it extends beyond that, it could be, depending on who's on the admissions committee. Okay, so those are our 2 questions. So now we're back in-house.
How would we be able to find out different kind of statistics on potential places we're interested in applying to? Like what they're, like, I mean, like maybe average GPA of those that are accepted, or like extracurriculars, or like.
Yeah, so how can you get statistics? Some places post some of those statistics online. So average GPA, I think we have on our website, it's a little bit old because we did this 4 years ago or 5 years ago, but at one point we computed some of these averages of GRE scores and I think GPA and stuff and posted that online. The only place you could get it is from the department, and only if they've calculated it. So that would be the only way to do it. And it's probably not the kind of thing you could just email them and say, hey, could you spend 8 hours going through all of your records for me and give me the stats on that? I mean, if it's not on their website, you're probably out of luck, I would guess. Yeah, sorry, that's not very helpful.
Does the APA have a guide on their website that has that information?
If it's been released elsewhere.
I'm sorry?
If it's been released elsewhere, they have.
Oh yeah, if it's been released elsewhere. Yeah, and I don't know how many departments have released that. It sounds like you know more about it than I do.
So I have a friend who it's in a different field, but she's starting her first semester of teaching in her doc program this fall, and we were talking a good deal, and she was feeling like she could really benefit from more coursework, and was kind of and she came right out of undergrad and was kind of wishing she had done something in the interim or had added something so that she had a little bit more just coursework under her belt. And thinking about that a lot makes me feel like that would be something I would benefit from. And I was so one option seems to be a master's if one can afford it, or if you can go to a funded one. But in the research I've done just on different programs, coming in with a master's will often shorten your time regardless in the PhD segment. So it doesn't necessarily put teaching off for any longer or give you a longer time. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions on that.
Yeah, master's programs were one of the sort of things on the bonus reel here that I was going to get to after admissions, but I can say a couple things directly to that. And this comes up in a couple of contexts, right? So sometimes we have people who apply to our program who weren't philosophy majors. They did something else. They did physics or biology or something, and then realized they wanted to do philosophy of physics or biology or even ethics or whatever. Those can be tough because, and we have admitted some students. I mean, it's a little bit of a dice roll because you don't know if they can really do philosophy, how good a philosopher they are. In a lot of those cases, it can be extremely beneficial to get an MA first, because then you can sort of prove your philosophy chops. You can get some coursework under your belt. You can get letters from philosophers who can speak to how good you were in those classes. So you get a lot of benefits from those. And there are some really good MA programs out there. It seems to be more prevalent than it used to be. I think it's still a minority, like a small minority of the applications we get are people with MAs, but it's been growing. It's more than it was 5 years ago, and that was more than 5 years before that. Even people who were philosophy majors getting an MA before they apply, that's ramping up. And some of the reasons are that it's ramping up. One is there's more interdisciplinary work, so you are getting more people who were a major other than philosophy who want to do philosophy, and that's a route they take. It's also beneficial if, for some reason, maybe your undergraduate record wasn't the best. It's a chance to almost kind of like start over. You've got a new transcript you're working on. You've got a new set of people who are going to be writing letters for you. For whatever reason, and now you might be able to sort of put a better package together and get into a better PhD program than you would have been able to get into if you just came straight out of bachelor's. So that can be a plus as well. In terms of teaching, personally, I think this is something that people lose way too much sleep over. Am I going to be on fellowship, or am I going to have to be a TA and teach while I'm working? My experience here, and also at Pitt, is that really is not as big of a fact. People are almost as productive, or put it this way, people on fellowship tend to be just as unproductive as people who are not on fellowship. It's not as big of a factor as people think it is. Now that might be different because I think departments differ in terms of how much work it is when you're TAing for them. Here it's, there's a union that the TAs belong to that set limits on how many hours and stuff like that. So I think here the TA workload, our grad students won't tell you that. They'll tell you that, but that's just because they don't know what the rest of the world's like. They'll tell you that it's arduous, but it's really not bad. And I think most places it tends to not be too bad. But I think there are some programs where the TA workload is a little heavier and can impact that. But I think for the most part it doesn't. Yeah, someone should be in charge of the queue because I'm sure I'm like missing who's next. But go ahead, Dan.
What I'm nervous about is applying to grad school and not having a definite idea of exactly what I want to study, and I don't know like someone did tell me like that might be good because then you're kind of like a blank, not a blank slate, but like they have more like room to mold you. Anyway, do I have to like figure it out before I?
No. So not knowing exactly what you want to do isn't really a big minus.
Okay.
That's most people. Well, most 51% maybe. Some people have a really firm idea. Some of them change that. So a lot of the people who are convinced they wanted to do X end up doing Y after the second year. So I don't think most admissions committees are going to care for that. I mean, if you do know, in some cases it can be a plus, like I said, right? If you really want to work in Phil Bio and you sent your paper, your honors thesis to Bill Bechtel, and he was super impressed with it and tells the admissions committee that you should really look at this person seriously, it can be a plus. That doesn't happen super often, but I think in general, yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. Don't be nervous. That's not bad. Anything else? Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Are transcripts looked at in sort of in relation to like grade inflation / deflation at all, or is that?
Generally, no. Because that would involve a lot of work. You have to,
Yeah.
You're staring down the barrel of 200 applications. Many of them have transcripts from multiple institutions. And now on top of that, I've got to spend 20 minutes trying to ferret out for each one, what the inflation index is and go to my Excel spreadsheet. I doubt that happens too much.
Okay, and then one other thing was, somebody told me that like applying to grad school without knowing like more than one language is not a good idea, and like especially
in philosophy.
Yeah, especially if you don't know the language of like whoever you're studying firsthand. Like if you want to do like French philosophy, you should definitely know French, etc. Whatever. So I wanted your opinion on that.
That hasn't been my experience. There have been cases where we've admitted students who knew they wanted to work on some historical thing, and it wasn't a big factor as to whether or not they already had the primary language or that language under their belt. Because the expectation is once they get here, they will. If they decide they still want to do that, they don't change their mind after a year. And that happens. People come in, they don't know any German, and by the time they're out of here, they know German pretty well. Because our con people, ensure that happens. And in fact, our department, I think, is actually pretty good about a lot of that. So for most languages, maybe not French, certainly not French, but we have a couple of sort of ongoing translation groups for German, Greek, and sometimes Latin. So for instance, if you did want to study Kant, you would come in, and one of the things you would do is to start attending these weekly translation meetings where you would get together with 2 or 3 or 4, 5 other people, some grad students, a couple of faculty, and just work through some text in the original language in German or Greek or whatever it is, and just get experience in that language. And in addition, you take courses if you needed to. Sometimes Eric Watkins, I don't know if he makes them do this, but all of his students end up spending a year in Germany somehow. And obviously then they come back, essentially fluent in German. So yeah, we don't worry too much about that. Anything else?
I think you can go on now.
Okay.
Well, I was wondering whether extracurricular involvement or related extracurricular involvement matters at all. So for service to the discipline. So if you are a philosophy club president, or you intern with the APA, or lead reading groups on philosophy?
Yeah, so things like, just repeating for, in case people at home didn't hear, extracurriculars like leading, being the president of the philosophy club, leading reading groups, interning for the APA. I think those are the examples you used. They can be a plus, especially if there's two kinds of cases. It might be directly academically connected. A lot of extracurriculars aren't. That's kind of what the extra means, is that it's not. But sometimes it can sort of speak to, your seriousness as a philosopher. So one of the things you kind of like to have in your program is, you want to have a lively program where people, get together, they read a lot of stuff, they have reading groups, they show up at colloquia. And so, if you have a critical mass of these sort of go-getter types, that can be a plus. So I could imagine that could be, if someone looks at it. But it's certainly not something people look for in admissions committees. They're not, there's not a separate column on the Excel spreadsheet for how many extracurriculars did this person do. It's not something that people typically look for.
Well, I suppose a follow-up question would be, like, what if one semester we got like a 3.7 and we didn't get a 4.0 but we were committed to TAing for a philosophy class and working X amount of hours per week, and we were president of so-and-so club.
Yeah.
Would that just look like, oh, that student was like stupid for overcommitting themselves, or?
No, I mean, it could be a plus, definitely. I mean, if you mention that in the letter or the statement somehow, that I only got a 3.7, but I was doing this philosophy-related thing. Again, depends on the person reading the letter. But it might. But it's like I said, it's not something people seek out. People do look for the letters. They look for, certain things. They don't go looking for extracurriculars. I think sometimes for undergraduate admissions, when high school students apply for undergraduate, they look for those kinds of things. That can be a big factor. But for grad admissions, it's not really an issue. Yeah.
If you've taken graduate courses, can you really tell from your transcript, because they're not labeled graduate, they just have a really high number. So do you ever look at weird looking courses and inquire letter? And if you do notice that it's graduate courses, does it matter?
Yeah, so the question is, do grad courses taken as an undergrad, does it matter? How could you spot those on the transcript? They are hard to spot. I mean, it's a lot tougher than you think it is when you get 200 applications, because all the transcripts are different. They're organized different. Some have the cumulative stuff at the top, some have it at the end. They're organized differently. Some are on 10-point scale. It's a mess, and their course numbering is crazy. They're all different. So it's hard. You're right. It's hard sometimes to spot those sorts of things. That's one of the cases where your letter writers come in. So someone who writes the letter for you, if they're doing their job, they're going to point out in the letter, oh, and this person, not only did really well in these undergraduate classes, but they were one of only 2 undergraduates who, in the last 4 years, who sat in on this graduate seminar and did really well. Then, it takes the guesswork out of it. Someone actually explicitly says that in the letter. And if it's not there in the letter and it's not, somehow flagged, then odds are slim that someone's going to be able to spot that, unless they're really going through that transcript carefully. And some people do. I'm not saying it's going to be impossible, but like you said, discerning course numbering can be a pain. It's like a hydra, you think you've cut someone down and then 7 more hands pop up. Yeah.
What about like the cohesiveness of the whole application? So like if somebody has like a physics letter and then they say like I'm interested in the philosophy of language and my essay is about Buddhism, is that like something that would hurt them?
It can raise questions, yeah. So I guess it's more a certain level of incoherence might hurt you as opposed to coherence helping you. But yeah, if someone was all over the map, and there wasn't any obvious explanation for it, then it wouldn't necessarily directly hurt, but it would at least raise an eyebrow, and people might then look again more carefully, like, why is this person, this writing sample when they said they were interested in that, and try to make sense of it. That could happen, definitely. Yeah.
If you are someone who has had articles published in undergraduate journals, would that be something to include in your personal statement, or would that be something that maybe one of your letter writers would write about?
Certainly, letter writers.
Okay.
Definitely that. If you that's when you go talk to your letter writer, make sure they're aware of that. So that's under the heading of helping your letter writers out. If you're not sure about whether it's going to get mentioned by one of your letter writers, then it's something you might in a statement, definitely. Do we have another question here from Nicole Ross? You talk some about things you could potentially include in the personal statement if they are relevant. For example, particular explanations. If those things aren't relevant, what would you suggest talking about in the statement? That's a good question. What if you don't have anything that needs explanation? What do you say? My advice in those circumstances would be to try to keep it concise. Nobody on an admissions committee wants to their 50th hour going through applications, read through 3 pages of a personal statement and get to the end and think, this didn't really say anything. This person just wasted another 5 minutes of my life. So be concise. Concision is good. Concision's a good thing. But you might talk about just what your interests are. I'm interested in philosophy of mind, and you guys are really good at that in your department. I like the work of so-and-so, and this is why I'm applying to you guys and hope I get in. So that would be something you could say. Suppose that's not true. Suppose there isn't anyone in that department that does anything that's relevant to your interests. What could you say? I don't know. At that point, this is one reason I don't like these personal statements, is they just raise these weird questions like that. My suggestion would be to if there is something that maybe stands out, like you did something great, as long as you keep it concise, it probably won't hurt you. But mention things you've done, extracurriculars that might help out, whatever. Just don't make 5 pages of it. Try to keep it short. Yeah.
So say somebody applies and they really want to get into your program and it just doesn't work out that time around. How do you look on somebody, the same person applying again? Do you have any recommendations for people who might get rejected the first time but want to keep trying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's any black mark that shows up on someone if they applied once and they didn't get accepted and they apply again. Some people may not remember, right? It's the different people on the admissions committee this year, and they may or may not even know that you applied last year. Even if they do know that you applied last year, I don't think many people would care, because every year's different. Maybe last year was here's an example. 2 years ago, I said we had this huge class that was 14 people. It's like double the size that we were looking for. The following year, we knew we needed a smaller class. So instead of admitting our normal 28, we only admitted, I forget, it was 18 or something like that. Which means that numbers 19 through 20 would have been admitted. We would have been perfectly happy admitting them if the last year's class wasn't so big, right? So the fact that they weren't admitted had nothing to do with their application not being good enough on an average year to be admitted to our program. It had to do with this completely other factor that had nothing to do with that. And so it could be that if this person applied again the year after, they would get accepted. So yeah, I don't think that's a problem, actually.
Do you encourage people who are like, you know, want to be persistent about a particular program to just keep going for it? Or
Yeah. I mean, you know, if I don't know how much it costs to apply every year, but you know, whatever that is, that's the only cost. So definitely. That's okay. I know you meant that as kind of a joke, but that's a good point to bring up. The comment was that the other costs can be sort of knocks to your confidence. One thing, this is one thing you have to get used to if you want to be a professional philosopher or academic, any kind of academic, is, you know, you kind of need to leave your ego at the door, because, you know, you're going to get rejected to most of the schools you apply to. Articles you submit to journals are going to get rejected. You're going to get criticisms on papers you submit to your advisor or dissertation chapters. There's a lot of rejection. You're going to apply to jobs, and most of them are going to reject you. Right. I would be happy to share with you guys the large file of you know, people who have turned me down for, you know, employment opportunities. So getting a kind of, it's not necessarily thick skin, but just realizing that that's just part of the process. There's going to be a lot of rejection. It doesn't necessarily reflect negatively on you. There's a lot of noise in the system. You know, because everyone on the admissions committee is different, and because there's so many weird factors. It's not always the best. You know, that ranking that a committee comes up with, you know, is not exactly going to be, you know, God's ranking of who actually is really objectively number 1 versus number 2 and 16 and 17. Right? There's going to be a lot of variation there. So the fact that you didn't get admitted, you know, you might still be the you know, one of the top 10 people who applied. You just didn't get admitted because you know, one of the people on the committee who read your file, you know, had gas, you know, that day, or food poisoning or something. They were in a bad mood and whatever. By the same token, the fact that you got admitted to some great graduate program doesn't necessarily mean you're awesome. It could just mean that the person who looked at your file was in a particularly good mood that time, and they overlooked you know, all of these things that should have been red flags, and they didn't care, and now you got admitted to this great program. You think you're awesome, and you know, so just realize there's noise in the system, okay, and it's a stochastic process, and maybe that'll help, you know, shield your ego to some extent from the exigencies of what happens. But there just is a lot of rejection as part of the job, you know. And it starts at grad school applications, and it never ends. Never. Yeah.
I was wondering if admissions committees have like higher expectations for people who are applying to joint programs.
I don't know if they're higher expectations, but they have sort of joint expectations, I guess, right? So they would. So for example, we have a couple of joint programs here at UCSD. We have an interdisciplinary cognitive science program, and you know, people who are interested in interdisciplinary philosophy of mind, cog-sci neuroscience, whatever, apply to that. There's also the science studies program, which is people who are interested in history and sociology of science and scientific practice and that sort of thing. And the departments that are part of that are communications, history, sociology, us. That might be it. I'm not sure. But when people apply to those, then, so for instance, with the science studies program, the way that works here is first the home department will admit them. So it's a philosopher who wants to be in this program, or it's a sociologist who wants to be in the program. The home department admits them, or doesn't. But if they do admit them, then the file goes, there's a separate admissions committee for science studies. They decide if they also want to admit the person to the interdisciplinary program. And they might say yes, they might say no. It might be that the person gets admitted to philosophy, but not to the interdisciplinary program. But different programs work differently. Our cog-sci program doesn't work that way. The way the cog-sci program works is people apply to the home department, don't apply to the cog-sci program at all when they are admitted. They just come into the home department. Then after their first year of being in grad school, they apply to the interdisciplinary program. I think just a matter of historical record, pretty much everyone who wants to be part of it is part of it. So you're not really taking a big risk if you wanted to come here and do that. But, oh, no, I need to actually accept and be there for a year before I'll know if I can be in the program. You'll be in the program probably, unless you really nosedive your first year. You'll be okay. But every interdisciplinary program is kind of different in terms of how they do their admissions and what kinds of things they will look for. So I can't really give you a short answer, other than probably to some extent they will want to have some evidence that you've got some chops in both areas, probably. Anything else? You guys are killing me here, man. I really wanted to get out long before 9, and I've got like other stuff I was going to talk about, and I mean, it's okay. They're actually great questions, so I don't feel that bad about that, other than that my goal is kaput. Yeah.
I didn't have a question at all. I was just being
You were just being, okay, that was pretty good.
Is it a relief?
But that said, I don't want to like squash questions. I mean, it's okay. I can handle the disappointment if there's more, because they're all good, so that's fine. Yeah.
Well, this might only apply to a few students, but if you're coming from a school that is religiously affiliated, would that count against you? Okay.
No, I don't think so.
And then follow up, if you published something or like co-authored something that was published in a religiously affiliated journal, might that count against you?
I don't think so. It might count. It might be a plus depending on the program. If the department has some kind of philosophy of religion or religious studies slant to it, that could be a plus. But I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be a minus for any program. Yeah.
This might vary from department to department, but what's considered like a solid GPA and a solid GRE score?
Oh, well, the GPAs we get are overall pretty good. For the people we admit, they're there's a lot of 4.0 GPA and higher. You'd be astonished how many people just. I mean, it almost kind of irritates me, when I see that. Just, did you really do anything other than try to keep your GPA high? Did you take any hard classes? And maybe they did. I don't know. But it tends to be fairly high GPA, and the GREs, I don't remember the averages, but I could try and look that up. I've got statistics on that. I do a lot of stats on stuff just as a kind of personal habit to try to learn things about what's going on in the world, and so I've done stats on this. So I have this information somewhere, just not on the tip of my tongue.
So what's a bad GPA?
A bad GPA, certainly anything under 3.0 doesn't look good. I'm not saying it's impossible to get accepted to grad school if you have something under 3.0, but yeah, I would not get accepted to grad school today. If with my application, which was submitted in 1990, Jesus, 24 years ago, holy fuck. Oh God. But okay, whatever. I would not. My overall GPA was 3.3. Why? When I first started undergrad, the idea of going to grad school was never in my head. I wasn't trying to get a high GPA because I didn't think it mattered or would matter. I did a lot of stuff. I was initially a math and physics guy and did some engineering courses, and they just tend to have low GPA anyway. I did crazy stuff like take a bunch of ancient Greek classes, which are pretty hard. So I just wasn't thinking ahead, right? Because I didn't know. I don't know if I would have done things differently if I did know, but. And I had like a 3.6 GPA in my major. That would not fly today, for the most part. A 3.3, it's not horrible, but it's really not good. I mean, at the time, I did my graduate work here at UCSD. I think at the time UCSD was ranked like number 8 or something like that. You're not going to get into the number 8 place with a 3.3 GPA today. That's just not going to happen. My GREs were pretty good, but the GPA wasn't. I'll try to get that information, and give it to you. Or it might actually be published, if that's correct, sort of average GPAs and GRE scores. There might be some data collection on that. But it definitely favors people who, for instance, come from academic families or who have gone into the undergraduate process already thinking that graduate school was a possibility, and sort of having that knowledge work into their decision-making process from step one. Which for a lot of people, that was one reason it wasn't for me. My parents didn't have college degrees. I was like first-generation college person, so graduate school was not even, probably didn't even know what it was, which is one reason my GPA was low. So it kind of favors that in a way that I think is kind of weirdly unfair, but I don't know how to solve that problem. But just as a matter of fact, the GPAs tend to be pretty high. Yeah.
When our GPAs are considered, is it mainly the cumulative or the major?
Try to get information on both, although sometimes it's hard because sometimes transcripts don't separate those out in a clear way. But if they are separated out in a clear way, then that is information that people on admissions committees will try to take account of, definitely. All right. Okay, well, we can still get out before 9, because there were a few other things I wanted to talk about besides applying to grad schools. One was master's programs. I've already talked about that a little bit and some of the benefits. Keep in mind, here's one thing I can say. And many of you probably know this, but some of you might not. Some master's programs are such that you have to pay a lot of money to go there. Some actually provide funding. Obviously, if you can go to one that provides funding, that's going to be a lot better. Well, except some of the ones you have to pay are like really, really good programs. But for example, we've had really good luck with Georgia State master's program. We have a number of our grad students who came from Georgia State. Cami, Catherine, for example, a couple of the older grad students from previous years. They just, for some reason, they just do a good job, or they do some kind of job that sort of resonates with whoever we have on our admissions committees, and we think they're pretty good. But there are other really good programs too, so that there can be a plus to that, especially if you have a low GPA or you don't have a lot of philosophy courses under your belt or something like that. But like I said, I've already talked a lot about that. One thing I did want to talk about, because this is sort of important, I think this is something that might help some of you out, is writing, and in particular writing process. Now Amy is going to have a workshop tomorrow on a writing seminar. What I'm going to say is not going to be the kind of thing Amy's going to talk about. Amy's going to focus mostly on the structure of papers, what kind of paper structure is good and is going to look good to admissions committees, or is just generally a good structure, a good kind of sample paper or philosophy paper in general. I'm not going to say anything about that. I'm going to say some stuff about a different topic, which is the process of writing. If you decide to become a philosopher, or probably any kind of humanities, go into academia in most humanities, there's a very real sense in which you're signing up to become a professional writer. It might not sound like it at first. No, I'm a philosopher. My job is to think and not to write. Well, sort of, but if you look at it, pretty much every single milestone or every single achievement or whatever that you're going to have in philosophy is going to be based on your writing. You'll get a PhD based on your dissertation, which is a bunch of words on paper. You're going to get a job based on articles that you've published and your dissertation. They're not going to care how many books you read. You can say, I read 1,000 books. I don't care. What have you published? When you get tenure, it's going to be based on your published work. So there's a very real sense in which what you're signing up for is to become a professional writer. That's the sort of currency of your progress in the field and your standing in the field. Because of that, it's important to sort of adopt the right, a kind of a professional approach to writing. And no offense to anybody here, but when I talk about this, I lecture our grad students on this all the time. When I lecture them on this, I sort of talk about it as a sort of an undergraduate approach to writing versus a sort of professional approach to writing. Now, there's a lot of different professional approaches. I'm kind of sort of talking about one kind of professional approach that's close to kind of how I approach it. But the undergraduate approach is very project driven, right? Like, oh, I've got a paper due, you know what the paper's on, you write an outline for the paper, you figure out how long it's going to take you to produce 5 or 10 or 15 pages, and then you start writing, maybe from an outline, maybe not, and you produce the paper, you turn it in. Okay, maybe there's a round of revision on it, possibly, maybe not. Okay. That's a horrible way to write professionally. One thing that's wrong about that is that oh, shut this door. Oh, you got it. So I used to play a lot of racquetball, sort of tournament racquetball. In fact, I was the president or the coach of the UCSD racquetball club for a while. And you can tell who's going to be a good tournament player and who's going to suck at tournaments. And how do you tell? The people who are going to end up being good tournament players are the ones who are in the court when there's not a game, just practicing. They're bouncing the ball off the sidewall and practicing their backhands for 45 minutes with their iPod on. And then they're practicing Z-serves. They're practicing ceiling balls for another 45 minutes. Versus the rec players, they're the ones who come in when there's a game. They play a game with their friends. Maybe it's a hard game, and when the game's over, they go away. Maybe it's 5 games or whatever. But that's like the undergraduate approach, right? It's, oh, I've got to write a paper, I'm going to write a paper. And that's it. And if you don't have to write a paper, you're not writing anything. You're out getting drunk or whatever, right? If you're a professional writer, you just need to get good at your craft. And a lot of that can just mean, for instance, every day you spend 2 hours writing, or 5 hours, or whatever. Bob Brandom has told his grad students at Pitt, they just write 8 hours a day. Okay. Maybe he's mellowed out. This was a long time ago. He told people that, but it could be anything. It could be you just writing out objections you have to a paper that you read, or you read a paper and it sparked an idea in your head, and so you're just going to write out like that. No one's going to see that, maybe, but you. You're the only person who's going to read the 5 pages you wrote that day. Just like these, 50 minutes of backhands that this racquetball player did, that has nothing to do with any game. No one's going to see that this person did that. He's the only person who knows that he was in the court for an hour doing backhands. But it's going to pay dividends when he does play a game, because this person's going to just mop the floor with the person who wasn't in there for 50 minutes practicing backhands. Similarly, if you just are consistently writing all the time, whether there's a project or not, you're going to get better at formulating your thoughts, putting them into prose, being able to make something that initially was 2 pages, 1 concise, tight page. You're just going to get tighter at your craft, number 1, which is what you want to do. You want to become a better writer. 2, if you do it correctly, it can take a lot of the stress out of writing. Writing's very stressful for people. Why? Because they have a project, they have to write the project, they're going to get an A on it or an F on it, so a lot hangs on this writing episode. I've got 8 hours of writing time, and when that dinger goes off, I'm going to get an F or an A. There's a lot writing on it. It's very stressful. Okay. On the other hand, if you just write 4 hours every day, so this is kind of what I do, I don't have, I try to avoid having any deadlines for things. I'm going to write 4 hours today. Maybe that 4 hours I'll produce a paper that's publishable, great. Maybe that 4 hours I'm going to write a bunch of stuff that I end up thinking sucks, and I'm going to erase it all, or it's just going to go into a file that I'm never going to access again. No one's going to see it. Fine. I don't care. What I do know is that over a month, there's going to be some good stuff that comes out of that, statistically speaking. It's going to be very hard for there not to be some good stuff that's just going to emerge from that process, okay? And that stuff that emerges just becomes stuff that ends up in papers that are eventually going to get published, right? Even if I'm working on a paper, I got a specific paper I'm working on, I'm going to put 4 hours in on this. Maybe that 4 hours makes no progress on that paper. So everything I tried out, every paragraph I wrote, I don't really like that. Fine, I don't care. Tomorrow, maybe some of the stuff I write will. So the pressure's off completely, 100% off. I don't care if at the end of 4 hours I didn't produce anything. So writing now isn't a chore, or it's not scary, which means I can go into it and just crank out 4 hours. A lot of professionals work that way, professional coders, right? They don't go to work that day thinking, oh God, I need to write this algorithm and it's got to be perfect by the end of today. I mean, maybe that happens from time to time if they're behind schedule. But often it can just be, I'm going to code. I'm going to write code. It might all suck. It might be buggy. I might have to start over from scratch tomorrow. But if they're a good coder, what's going to happen over time is they will produce a certain amount of really good code, and that's what makes them valuable. Even if any given hour span of their coding might be crap. They might produce stuff that doesn't work. So I guess my advice to you guys would be to just start writing a lot. In whatever way, try to get into the habit of every week, or maybe every day, or 5 days a week, or whatever it is, just start writing stuff. Write out weird, crazy ideas you have about philosophy, write out responses to things you've read, try to articulate some weird idea that you had. Okay, I asked this question in class the other day, but that's not really what I meant to ask, and I'm going to write it out better. Even if no one sees it, don't care about that. You're working on your craft, you're getting better, and over time, you can't help but start accumulating things that are going to be pretty good. And the result of that is going to be that you're going to end up being a better writer and hence better philosopher because of that. So I guess that's my writing advice to you. It's about the process as opposed to structure. Amy will talk tomorrow about structure and what kind of structure look good versus ones that don't look good. But any questions on writing process? There are some people who are just binge writers. Like even among our grad students, some of them do well with that, right? They don't do any writing. They've got a paper that's due for a journal. They kind of like reverse engineer how long they are going to need, and then at that point they start 14 hours a day just cranking out this paper. And after 2 weeks of coffee and cigarettes and speed and cocaine, they've got this paper that they then submit to the journal. And maybe it's a pretty good paper, right? That works for some people, I guess, but it's really stressful. It's not I would not, unless that's just the process that you resonate with and you love and you want to do, I would try to steer you away from that and do something that's lower stress and more regulated, I guess. Any questions? No? That was it. My writing advice, just so clear and convincing that.
Really
good. All right.
Well, I suppose how do you balance the?
Totally kidding.
Thank you, Paige. How do you balance the scheduled? I'm just gonna write for X amount of hours every day with the productivity, because I've been starting the writing process this summer, and that's one of the concerns that I have as well. I'd like to have this writing project finished by the end of summer, and I'm putting in this daily time, but it's hard to gauge how close I am. And so if we want to apply this type of process to, I don't know, term papers or...
Yeah, the process I described gets easier to implement when there are fewer or longer term deadlines, right? And so for me it works great because I purposefully set up my professional career so I don't have any deadlines. how do I do that? I just say no to everything. Hey, do you want to submit an article to this collection? Or no. Would you like to come give a talk next week on this topic that you haven't worked on yet? Really, I hope no. I don't. What I do is I work on projects that I want to work on, and then when they're finished and I'm happy with them, then at that point, if someone says, hey, do you want to submit a paper to this? And I've got something already, you know, that I finished last month, I'll say, yeah, I've got a paper. I can give you that. Or I'll submit it to a journal or something like that. But it's always on my schedule, right? It's a little harder to do what I described if you've got deadlines. But it's still not that hard, because what it means is that you just need to sort of be more diligent with the process. So for instance, if you know there's a paper due at the end of the summer, whatever, that's 2 months from now or something. If you wrote for 2 hours a day, every day, for 2 months, that's 120 hours of writing. A lot, right? I don't know how long this paper is, but let's say it's 10 pages. That, you know, what that means is that you could produce, I don't know how fast you write, but just ballparking it, in an hour, without revisions, I could probably produce per hour at least a page of text. So if you get 120 pages, and then you just cut out the worst 110 of them, right? You're going to get, those 10 pages are going to be pretty good. So you can still do that process. Right? And most of my published work is like that. Probably for every page that actually shows up in a journal, there's probably 10 or 15 pages of paragraphs that I ended up not liking, that I deleted. It's a draft that I decided to structure completely differently. And that stuff nobody ever sees. You know, it's in some archive in my computer somewhere. But you know, the 5% that did make it out are pretty good because of the 95% that didn't. You know, you're creating a sort of survival of the fittest atmosphere if you're diligent with it. Yeah, if you've got philosophical talent, that process, you know, can't help but yield good stuff if you just stick with it. Yeah.
As far as like when you get to the point where you've got something that you're pretty happy with and you want someone else to take a look at it, I mean, is that the point where you start submitting to journals and just like go all out and you're like, all right, I'm just going to send it out and see what happens? Or do you start sending it to like maybe colleagues or like, you know, people that you respect and, you know?
Is the you me, or is it just one? Does one send out papers to colleagues one respects?
Whatever.
Oh. I think that's kind of generally what happens. So, yeah, typically people will work on something for a while. They'll get it up to some degree of polish that they're comfortable with, and different people are comfortable with different degrees. Some people really don't like showing people stuff that they aren't already pretty happy with, whereas some people don't mind sharing stuff that they know is really rough and has a lot of, you know, rough edges on it. And then at that point they get feedback from people. Again, how many people is a matter of taste. I'll usually submit, sort of send things off to a small number of people who I trust their opinion, and I know they read things carefully. Other people will, you know, submit very widely. Again, it's just a matter of preference. I don't think there's many people, and it's probably not a great idea to just submit something to a journal that you haven't had anyone else look at and give you any feedback on. And it's not impossible, but you know, it's a good, easy way to really improve something is to have someone, you know, another pair of eyes take a look at it and give you some feedback. At least one other person or a couple people. That's a good way to improve something, but you don't have to. I kind of thought I saw a handish looking thing over there. Oh, scratching your head. Okay, that would explain it. All right, are we finished here? Before 9? Yes! All right. Well, thanks for coming. And now, if none of you get into grad school, that means I suck. And my advice is totally lame. So, yeah. I'm sorry?
We'll let you know.
You'll let me know. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.